I show you how deep the rabbit hole goes.
And movies that had stories.
That the story just sucks them in.
This is just the beginning.
Stories. We would be honored if you would join us.
Hello and a very warm welcome back to Film Stories with Simon Brew. I am Simon Brew, that's all really you need to know about me. Let's kick off with a clip from the film I'm going to talk about in this episode. "1992 then is this one. It's Batman Returns, directed by Tim Burton. The follow-up to, obviously, 1989's juggernaut Batman, the film that completely changed how we look at comic book movies, I would argue, and certainly how they perform in terms of being massive blockbuster films. Off the back of the huge success of the original Batman starring Michael Keaton, Warner Brothers was very, very keen to get working on a sequel. Tim Burton less so. He directed the first against considerable pressure. He never really gave the impression of having the best time on the film. The first one was shot in London, and it just turned into this gigantic phenomenon. Straight after doing Batman, Burton then just decided he needed to go off and do something different. So he went and made Edward Scissorhands for 20th Century Fox, starring Johnny Depp. In the meantime, Warner Brothers was looking to get the sequel to Batman filming in 1990, a year after the release of the first film. So they spent a sizable amount of money storing the astonishing sets that were put together by Anton Furst, the late Anton Furst, for the first film. But Burton originally was very reticent, and in fact made noises that he wouldn't be returning to direct the next film. Having gone away and made Edward Scissorhands, he did in the end decide to come back to Batman Returns, but a bit more. I mean, the story goes, and there's truth to it, that this one was more on his own terms, that he was looking to do. He wasn't looking to make the same film again, and also he was not keen really to make a sequel. He doesn't describe Batman Returns as a sequel to Batman. He just describes it as another story. In fact, there are very few direct links between the two films. There's a line that Bruce Wayne says to Alfred, who let Vicky Vale in the Batcave, which does directly refer back to something that happens at the end of 1989's Batman movie. And Burton admitted basically he put that line in because of all the people who were angry about that moment in the first film. But in terms of everything else, I mean, this was transformative, really, in that it established that as you went from one superhero movie to another, you could change things, right down to the changed look of the batsuit that Michael Keaton wore, and the deliberate decision to make it look, if anything, slightly less realistic and more armoured. The script that eventually came together was Burton homed in an idea from Daniel Waters, who penned Heathers, and the whole idea of Oswald Cobblepot, straight the Penguin, played by Danny DeVito, running for mayor of Gotham City. He was also taken with the idea of having three villains, of having Catwoman, of having Max Schreck, and there's a tip of the hat there to those who know their vintage horror films, and with the idea that Schreck, played by Christopher Walken, was arguably the biggest monster of all of them. That you had these monsters, these foes, but it was the human being who you were most afraid of. He did. He loved the idea of packing his film with misfits. We've got the circus gang in the movie, and Burton argues, in fact, on the director's commentary to the Batman Returns disc, that he's never met anyone who finds clowns funny. Everyone seems to be scared of clowns, and certainly that did the recent adaptation of Stephen King's It no harm whatsoever. When it came to physical production, the idea Burton switched. He didn't want to return to Pinewood, and instead switched to Los Angeles with sets rebuilt and basically a huge geographic change. Burton was obviously in a position to request this, and Warner Brothers wasn't going to object either. As Burton would point out, he was basically now on the studio's doorstep, even though it was shot both at Warner Brothers and Universal. He was in Los Angeles, and the studio were closer than they'd ever been. Burton did say that the move to Los Angeles made it fresher for him, just as a production, but also when it actually came to the mechanics of making the film, it didn't necessarily improve things. I mean, he was still in the midst of a big, gigantic movie under fairly sizable studio pressure. Interestingly, on the studio pressure point, he argued, if anything, Warner Brothers was more afraid of the second film than the first, that there was an element of fearlessness when making the first Batman movie, in that they didn't know what they had. They didn't know that it was going to be quite the sensation that it proved to be, and thus by the time it came around to the second film, everyone was there was that level of expectation that was back. I remember Premiere magazine, for instance, in the lead up to the film being released, Warner Brothers took out 3 consecutive right hand pages in that magazine, one for the bat, one for the cat, one for the penguin, which was the heart of the promotional campaign for the film. I mean, everything was ramped up for it. I remember Michael Keaton being interviewed on the Wogan Chat Show program, the late Terry Wogan, bless him. And the question was inevitable: are you doing Batman 2? And Keaton just almost looked resigned and went, probably. And of course Julie did, and he re-signed for the role. This was before the days where you were signed up to play, if you took on a comic book character, you had to sign a contract committing yourself to 3 movies. Keaton also, Burton dispels a little bit of a myth on the director's commentary again for Batman Returns, in that Keaton was on board with the idea that Batman wasn't really the main character in the films, that he was supposed to be this recluse. When you first see him in Batman Returns, after all, he sat just by himself in Wayne Manor when the bat signal goes up, and that's our first catching up of him since we saw him on the rooftop at the end of Batman. And it's very clear instantly that Bruce Wayne, is living this life of solitude. Interesting things about the production to me. Now, Burton's a huge fan of miniatures and models. And so the sweep through Gotham Zoo at the start of the film, he wanted that to be a miniature because he just loved the idea that he can move his camera around an awful lot more. So there was more of a meeting of old and new filmmaking styles going on in this movie than I'd first appreciated. It's only when I came back to it and did some deeper research on it, I was like, okay, there's some quite interesting stuff going on here, because this was a film where CG started to just be gently introduced. This was the infancy of CG effects. So as you go through the Batcave, as you go through the tunnel at the start with the character we know who will be the Penguin in the basket, and you get the bats flying towards you. Those were digital bats, and it sounds like a very small thing now because it just wouldn't even be a question. But that was quite a shift forward at the time. Interestingly, when the basket goes over the waterfall, that's Burton has said that was his little hat tip to the Pirates of the Caribbean ride at Disneyland. Burton being a huge fan of that particular ride. The other thing I think that, and it goes for the first Batman movie as well, that even though there were just 1 or 2 shots as exteriors, which I believe were the Wayne Manor shots in the first Batman film, what's really surprising now is Batman, and particularly Batman Returns, were shot on a studio lot. Now, if you contrast that with, for instance, Christopher Nolan's Batman Begins and The Dark Knight, Nolan made took huge advantage of using the exteriors. I think it was Chicago that was doubling for Gotham City in those 2 films. Burton didn't. Everything was built. Everything that you see in that film was built, again with the exception of Wayne Manor, the exterior. But I mean, it's quite extraordinary to look at now. So if you if you look at the just jumping back into 1989's Batman movie, the incredible look of Gotham City in that film is just physical. It's just all done physically. But in terms of the film story and how that affected how Burton could shoot Batman Returns, one of the most surprising, well, it's not surprising when you think about it, I guess, but one of the most impactful constraints that he was working under was just physical space. Now, as he's gone on to say, when you're shooting action scenes, particularly when you're shooting action scenes involving cars, you need the space. If you go back to, what was it, Fast and Furious 6, where the never-ending runway, all of course had to be done outside. I think one of the Matrix sequels, they just built a freeway just so they could have the flexibility to do a scene. Burton shot the car sequences of Batman Returns on the Warner Brothers lot, on the back lot. Pretty much everything else was on a soundstage or an interior. Every action scene. So when the circus gang come attacking, it's an action scene shot within a studio, and the constraints that puts upon you. Further constraints as well. They had live animals. They had live penguins on the set. Sometimes they had child actors as well, and they had to vary the temperature depending on what creatures were on the set at any one time. Just going back to the Batmobile again for instance, so just coming back to the CG point I touched on before, the Batmobile used CG effects for its armor for the first time, and again you begin to get a flavor of just how subtly CG can be woven into a movie. There was, of course, in the run up to the film, a fairly sizable casting issue that Burton came up against, because Annette Bening was originally cast as Catwoman and came very, very close to playing the role. And Benning's talked about this more recently. In that the costume fittings were done, they were coming close to production, and then Benning discovered she was pregnant and delivered the news to Burton, and he didn't have a lot of time to find his replacement. Now, the infamous story is Sean Young, who'd been cast in the original Batman as Vicky Vale, I believe, before an injury befell her, came onto the Warner Brothers lot in Catwoman costume. I don't know that for definite, but it's a story that's been around an awful lot. But Burton settled on Michelle Pfeiffer for the role, and in hindsight has said he can't ever imagine anyone else doing it. Pfeiffer, perhaps one of the most infamous scenes in the film involving Pfeiffer, is the moment where the bird flies out of her mouth. And even though we're in an era where CG was just coming in, she did actually do that for real. That was completely her. There was. It was clearly a lot darker film, and that would come into play, particularly when it came to the response to the movie. But in terms of how that went during production, now you would imagine a studio would be all over it. But in spite of the increased nerves and the slightly lower fearlessness that Warner Brothers had with Batman Returns, it was relatively hands-off in allowing Tim Burton to put the film on screen that he wanted to put on. And so they didn't like, for instance, Burton has said, the black stuff that came out of Danny DeVito's mouth towards the end of the film. They weren't a fan of that at all, but they didn't try and stop him. And Burton has said that the studio was supportive. Even things like the nose bite. I don't know if you record it, but around the time of the release, McDonald's had its traditional tie-ins, etc., done, and the sheer darkness of moments like that, and almost the horror undertones of it were leading to an awful lot of backlash against the movie. In fact, I think a fairly sizable number of parents complained about the film, although I find that a little bit tough when you consider just how dark the first movie is as well. Although I will say in the first one that no one bit anyone's nose and made it gush with blood. The response to the film when it came out is Burton was a lot happier with it. It was more his movie. I think the first half hour of Batman Returns is just great. I still think stylistically it's brilliant. I think Danny Elfman was encouraged and did put together new cues for the new characters in the film. I think it's a fair complaint that it runs out of story, that there's not a massive story to tell. And that the last half hour, as much as I enjoy it, you kind of feel the pinch of that a little bit. However, I think it's a really a really strong, interesting vision from a really interesting director who had a degree more freedom to put across the film that he wanted. Now, the problem he faced was we're back to that level of expectation, really. And as much as Warner Brothers was supportive of Burton, it wouldn't have been as happy with the box office gross. Now, there was a rule of thumb for sequels at the time that sequels made something around 65% of the original movie's takings. Now, of course, a studio will go into it thinking if you made the first film, it's basically a setup for the sequel, and the sequel's where you make the huge bucks. Not so back 20-30 years ago, where sequels, whilst they were commonplace, were not seen as the cash cows that they are now. And originally, I think the US gross didn't come in too far off 65% of the original Batman movie. And Burton, off the back of it, would reiterate that he didn't want to make another Batman film, and this time he did indeed stick to his word. And the darkness that underpins Batman Returns and the freedom he had to put that in, it's not too tricky to draw a line to what would happen next, and the appointment of Joel Schumacher to direct what would be known as Batman Forever. But that film is a whole other film story. This has been Film Stories. Thank you so much for your support. You can find me on Twitter at Simon Brew. You can find the podcast on Twitter at Film Stories Pod. It's hugely appreciated any oxygen you can give to this little podcast. I'm not a multinational conglomerate, more for me, and thus every little bit of word of mouth helps. Thanks a lot for listening, and I'll be back again soon with some more film stories.